HOA used $7,600 of community funds to cover water damage in the clubhouse that was caused by their own negligence. Rain had been falling over Willow Creek Estates for 2 days straight when Marissa pulled her car into the community parking lot and noticed something odd. The usually quiet and neat clubhouse, a building she had walked past hundreds of times, seemed different. From the outside, everything looked normal. The freshly painted siding glistened under the heavy rain. But a faint, musty smell drifted from the slightly open front door. Marissa frowned. She had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years, attending events and board meetings at the clubhouse, and she knew that smell meant trouble. As she stepped inside, the source became painfully clear. Water had seeped through the ceiling, dripping in slow, relentless streams onto the polished wooden floors. Puddles had formed near the entrance, reflecting the dim overhead lights in warped, shaky patterns. Some of the new chairs, which had been carefully arranged for a weekend seminar, were soaked at the legs. Tables were wobbly with water damage creeping across their surfaces. Marissa's heart sank. This wasn't just a minor leak. It was a serious flood, and the damage was spreading fast. She knelt to blot the water with a towel from the janitor's closet and couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. How could something like this happen in a building that was supposed to be regularly maintained? The clubhouse was the pride of Willow Creek Estates, hosting everything from yoga classes and birthday parties to the occasional board meeting. Now it looked like the aftermath of a storm that had no mercy. Marissa knew that the community fund, which all residents contributed to, would be used to fix this. And the figure that had been mentioned in passing by Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, made her stomach twist. $7,600. Within the hour, neighbors began to arrive, drawn by the unmistakable smell of mildew and the echoing drip of water. Jeremy, a retired firefighter who lived just a few doors down, was the first to assess the scene. "This is serious," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "If this goes untreated, it could compromise the structure itself. The boards, the flooring, even the foundation near the entrance could rot if it isn't fixed immediately." Other residents started murmuring, raising their voices slightly as they discussed what could have caused the leak. Some blamed the rain, others pointed to old pipes, and a few, like Marissa, wondered aloud why past maintenance reports had not prevented this disaster. Karen Whitfield finally arrived, clipboard in hand, wearing the tight smile that had become familiar to residents over the years. Her gaze swept the room, landing briefly on each concerned neighbor before settling on Marissa. "We're handling this," she said, in a tone that was meant to reassure but instead felt oddly defensive. "The HOA has funds set aside, and the repairs will begin immediately. There's no need for anyone to worry." Her words did little to calm the growing tension. Several residents whispered among themselves, unsure whether they could trust a board that seemed to be handling the crisis as if it were routine rather than a direct result of negligence. The contractor arrived mid-morning, carrying a set of tools and a clipboard of his own. He walked through the dripping room, tapping floors and walls with practiced precision, taking photos and jotting notes. Within minutes, the extent of the damage became undeniable. The wooden floors had warped from standing water, some panels already buckling. The new chairs, carefully selected for comfort and durability, had legs soaked through and weak spots beginning to form. Water had seeped into the walls, causing discoloration and softening the drywall in several areas. The smell of wet wood mixed with mildew filled the air, making Marissa's stomach churn. The estimated repair costs quickly became a hot topic. $7,600. For residents who paid monthly dues meticulously calculated to cover landscaping, pool maintenance, holiday events, and minor repairs, the number was staggering. A quiet tension grew in the room. People whispered about how the money would be taken from the reserve fund, a fund carefully maintained for emergencies, not for problems that could have been prevented. Marissa's neighbor, Linda, an accountant, quietly began calculating in her head what the $7,600 would mean for other planned projects. The community pool resurfacing and the new playground equipment would now be postponed, possibly indefinitely. The conversation soon turned to responsibility. Who had let this happen? Karen and the board members present offered vague reassurances, citing prior minor leaks and claiming that everything had been handled according to protocol. But the residents weren't convinced. Records showed that minor leaks had been reported months ago, with work orders supposedly completed. Yet here they were, facing significant damage, the repair bill hanging over the community like a storm cloud. Marissa felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. It wasn't just the water, it was the negligence that allowed it to happen. She wondered aloud why proper inspections hadn't prevented the leak. By evening, the cleanup crew had mopped the worst of the water and placed fans around the room to dry the carpets and floors. Damp chairs were stacked in corners, furniture was wiped down as best as possible, and contractors promised to begin structural repairs the following week. Still, the air felt heavy with tension. Residents drifted away, silent, glancing back at the puddles that reflected the overhead lights in their distorted forms. Marissa stayed behind a few moments longer, staring at the warped floor and thinking about what the $7,600 meant, not just in dollars, but in trust lost. The next few days were filled with hushed conversations and growing unease. Text messages circulated among neighbors, discussing what had happened and questioning the board's oversight. Marissa, along with a small group of concerned residents, began digging through past HOA meeting notes and emails. They noticed mentions of leaks, promises to fix them, and repeated assurances that everything was under control. The reality was far different. The damage was not sudden or unavoidable. It was the culmination of neglect and mismanagement. Marissa's resolve solidified. She couldn't stand by while her community's funds were used to cover avoidable mistakes. Somewhere in the records, in the emails, or in the decisions made by the HOA board, the answers were hidden. She would find them. The truth wouldn't just explain the $7,600 spent, it would reveal who had failed the community and why. And she knew that when the full story came to light, the impact would be far greater than anyone expected. That night, as the rain continued to patter on the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates, Marissa walked home, reflecting on the day's events. Streetlights reflected on the wet pavement like tiny stars scattered across the asphalt. She could see the clubhouse in her mind, water still pooling across its floor, walls damp, and furniture ruined. Somewhere inside, she made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth, and she would make sure the HOA board could not hide behind excuses any longer. The first ripple of what would become a wave of accountability had begun, and Willow Creek Estates was about to feel it. There was a subtle shift in the air, a sense that something beneath the surface had been exposed. Residents who had once smiled and waved now exchanged cautious glances, and small groups lingered on sidewalks and driveways, whispering about the $7,600 repair bill. Marissa, however, didn't wait for gossip to feed her curiosity. She wanted facts. She pulled on her rain boots and jacket, grabbed her notebook, and began walking to the clubhouse to examine the scene more closely. Inside, the smell of wet wood and mildew lingered. The fans the contractors had installed whirred softly, circulating the damp air, while puddles slowly evaporated on the warped floor. Marissa carefully inspected the area where the water had seeped in. The ceiling tiles were stained and sagging, some cracked along the edges. She jotted notes about the location of each leak, the condition of the flooring, and the walls that had begun to bubble. It was meticulous work, but she knew that a careful record would matter if she needed to challenge the HOA's account of events later. As she worked, Linda arrived. The accountant neighbor who had already calculated the impact of the $7,600 repair on community funds stood with her arms crossed, scanning the room. "I've been reviewing the HOA's expense reports for the past year," Linda said quietly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the fans. "They've been cutting corners on maintenance. Look at these invoices. Some repairs were marked completed, even though there's no evidence anyone ever fixed them." She handed Marissa a stack of printed emails and reports. The emails detailed past maintenance requests for minor leaks, each stamped with a note from the board claiming resolution. Marissa read through them carefully. In every case, the leaks had persisted, often worsening over time. By mid-morning, more residents began trickling in. Samir, a software engineer with a keen eye for details, had begun comparing the dates on contractor invoices with reports of leaks. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a timeline he had created. They claimed to repair a leak in March, but complaints kept coming in through May and June. By August, the ceiling in the main hall was already damp. This isn't just negligence, it's a pattern. The room went quiet as people absorbed the implication. Funds had been spent repeatedly on supposed fixes, but the results were temporary at best. The $7,600 repair was not a fluke. It was the latest expense in a string of mismanaged maintenance. Karen Whitfield, the HOA president, arrived unexpectedly, flanked by a few board members. She wore her usual tight smile, but there was tension in her shoulders that even the strongest smile couldn't mask. "We're handling everything," she said quickly, surveying the group. "The repairs are underway, and the reserve fund is sufficient." "There's no need to worry." Marissa stepped forward. "Karen, with all due respect, we've gone through past reports and invoices. The leaks weren't fixed properly, and now the clubhouse has significant water damage. Residents need answers, not reassurances." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Karen hesitated for a moment before replying, "We followed standard procedures. Everything was documented, and the contractors did their part." Samir shook his head. "Standard procedures? Look at the evidence. Requests were ignored, repairs were incomplete, and invoices were filed as if the work was done correctly. The $7,600 being spent now, our money, is covering mistakes that were never addressed in the first place. Residents deserve to know why the oversight happened." Karen's smile faltered. The room had grown crowded with neighbors who had been quietly observing the exchange, and murmurs began spreading as more people realized the depth of the issue. Tension hung thick in the air. Marissa, Linda, and Samir formed a small coalition of concerned residents. They started compiling detailed records of maintenance requests, emails, contractor notes, and HOA financial statements. Each document revealed patterns of negligence. Minor leaks ignored for months, repairs half completed, invoices filed without verification, and repeated assurances to the community that everything is under control. The $7,600 repair wasn't an isolated incident. It was the latest evidence of systemic mismanagement that had been quietly draining the reserve fund and putting residents' trust at risk. By the end of the week, the coalition had grown. Several neighbors joined, bringing their own records and observations. One resident, a teacher named Rachel, had photographs of water stains from months prior that had been ignored by the HOA. Another, Marcus, had copies of invoices showing that some contractors had billed for work that had clearly never been done. Together, the group began piecing together a clear narrative. The damage to the clubhouse had not been caused by an unforeseeable accident. It had been the inevitable result of ongoing neglect. With this evidence, the residents decided to call for a special meeting of the HOA board. Notices were sent to all community members, and a formal agenda was prepared. The meeting was set for the following week in the same water-damaged clubhouse that had sparked the investigation. Residents were determined to confront the board, present the evidence, and demand accountability. Marissa felt a mixture of apprehension and determination as she prepared her notes. This wasn't just about $7,600. It was about the integrity of the community and the responsibility of those entrusted to manage it. The night before the meeting, Marissa walked past the clubhouse one more time. The water damage had been temporarily fixed, and fans still hummed softly as contractors ensured the space was dry. Yet the warped wood, the faint smell of mildew, and the memory of standing puddles reminded her that the real work was just beginning. As she gazed at the building, she realized that uncovering the truth would not only expose the board's mistakes, but also test the unity and resolve of the community itself. The coming confrontation would be tense, perhaps even explosive, but it was necessary. Willow Creek Estates deserved better than negligence, and the residents were finally ready to demand it. Residents poured into the clubhouse, their faces a mix of anger, frustration, and quiet determination. Chairs were arranged in rows facing the board's table at the front, and the room buzzed with murmurs as neighbors whispered about the $7,600 repair, past negligence, and what they hoped to achieve. Marissa, notebook in hand, took a seat near the middle of the room, flanked by Linda, Samir, Rachel, and Marcus. Together, they represented a growing coalition determined to demand transparency and accountability. Karen Whitfield entered first, accompanied by the other board members, each carrying stacks of papers and the practiced expressions of people accustomed to authority. She smiled at the residents, but it was a tight, strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clipped and formal. "We're here to discuss the clubhouse repairs and address your concerns regarding the recent water damage." Marissa noticed several people exchange skeptical glances. The phrase, "address your concerns," sounded more like a line from a speech than a genuine acknowledgement of responsibility. As Karen outlined what the board claimed were the causes of the water damage, residents began to interrupt. Jeremy, the retired firefighter, spoke first. "Karen, with all due respect, this wasn't a natural disaster or a freak accident. The leaks had been reported repeatedly. Repairs were either delayed or done improperly. Now the reserve fund has been drained by $7,600 to cover something that should have been prevented." A ripple of agreement moved through the room. Residents nodded, murmuring their own frustrations, and the tension grew palpable. Marissa stood up, clearing her throat. "We've compiled evidence that shows a consistent pattern of negligence. Emails and maintenance reports indicate that minor leaks were reported months ago, and invoices suggest work was either incomplete or never done. The money being spent now, our money, is covering mistakes that should never have happened. Residents deserve an explanation, not just assurances." Her voice, steady but firm, carried across the room. Many neighbors whispered their support, while others recorded the statements on their phones. Linda stepped forward, displaying a set of printouts for everyone to see. These documents show dates of reported leaks, work orders, and invoices. Notice that some repairs were marked as complete, yet follow-up reports confirm that the issues persisted. This is not an isolated incident. It's a clear pattern of negligence. $7,600 is significant, but what matters more is accountability. Karen shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. One board member cleared his throat nervously, but no one spoke up to defend the actions. The room grew heated. Marcus, holding his own stack of invoices, said, "And it's not just the money. We trusted the board to manage these responsibilities. Instead, we have evidence that the same problems kept recurring because proper oversight was never done. We need to know who approved these incomplete repairs, who signed off on invoices, and why no one took responsibility before this damage became severe." Rachel added, "Some of us even have photos showing the damage months before the $7,600 repair was required. This isn't an accident. It's preventable damage caused by negligence." Karen's voice, usually commanding, faltered slightly. The board followed all proper procedures. Contractors were hired and work orders were filed. Any delays or oversights were unintentional. We acted in good faith. Several residents scoffed audibly. Marissa spoke again, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Good faith doesn't erase repeated neglect. Our money shouldn't be used to cover avoidable mistakes. People need to be held accountable." At that moment, Samir stepped forward. "We've also compared past repair invoices with contractors' availability and confirmed that work billed as done could not have been completed on those dates. This is evidence of gross mismanagement at best, and possibly fraudulent reporting at worst." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's face drained of color, and a few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The residents were no longer asking for explanations. They were demanding answers backed by proof. Several long minutes passed in tense silence, the only sound the faint hum of the dehumidifiers that remained in the corners of the clubhouse. Finally, one resident shouted, "Enough with excuses! We want the truth!" Voices joined in, the collective frustration of the community filling the room. Karen took a deep breath, and for the first time, Her confident mask cracked. We will review the records again, she said, her voice lower, almost defensive. I cannot promise immediate answers, but the board will conduct an internal review. The response was met with skeptical murmurs and crossed arms. Residents were no longer satisfied with vague promises. Marissa realized that the confrontation had exposed something deeper than a single repair bill. It wasn't just $7,600. It was the system itself. The residents had uncovered negligence, mismanagement, and repeated failure to take responsibility. The air in the clubhouse was charged with anticipation, with the collective understanding that the next few weeks would reveal whether the HOA would finally act responsibly or continue to hide behind procedures and excuses. As the meeting ended, Marissa and her group stayed behind, gathering documents, photographs, and notes. They knew the board would try to control the narrative, and they wanted to be prepared. The coalition decided to present a formal request for a complete audit of HOA expenditures, specifically focusing on maintenance, repairs, and reserve fund usage. Their goal was not just to recover the $7,600 or prevent future misuse, but to ensure transparency and accountability in the management of their community. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the cloudy sky. Marissa walked home with a sense of determination. The confrontation had been intense, but it had also unified the residents. People who had once been quiet and passive were now engaged, ready to protect their neighborhood and their shared resources. Marissa knew that uncovering the full story would take time, effort, and persistence. But for the first time, she felt that real change was possible. Willow Creek Estates had faced a crisis, and the residents were now awake, vigilant, and ready to fight for their community. That night, as she reviewed her notes and prepared her documents for the formal request, Marissa reflected on the events of the past week. The clubhouse had been the spark, the $7,600 repair the visible symptom of a larger problem. The residents' determination, backed by evidence, had already shaken the board. The coming days would bring a formal investigation, potential consequences, and revelations that could change the way Willow Creek Estates was governed. The water damage was no longer just a repair bill. It was a wake-up call, and the residents were answering it with force and clarity. Marissa and the coalition had submitted a detailed request, and the HOA, under mounting pressure, reluctantly agreed to allow a third-party accounting firm to examine all records related to maintenance, repairs, and the reserve fund. From the moment the auditors arrived, the atmosphere at Willow Creek Estates shifted. Residents crowded around the clubhouse, curious and anxious, while Karen Whitfield and her board members moved with visible tension, aware that every transaction, every invoice, and every internal memo would be scrutinized. The audit team began by reviewing contractor invoices and past work orders. Almost immediately, discrepancies emerged. Several invoices for repairs matched the dates when no work had been documented as performed. Other invoices were padded with additional charges for services never rendered. Marissa, Linda, and Samir pored over the documents alongside the auditors, cross-referencing emails and past complaints. The evidence was mounting quickly. The water damage to the clubhouse had not been an isolated failure. It was part of a pattern of negligence and mismanagement that stretched back months, if not years. As the auditors dug deeper, they uncovered internal emails from the board acknowledging the leaks but dismissing them as minor issues to avoid spending money. One email from a month before the major water damage read, "Minor ceiling leak reported. Will monitor. Repairs can wait until next quarter to avoid overspending reserve fund." Another email instructed the secretary to file completion as done, even though the contractors had never performed the repairs. The coalition shared these findings with the residents, and a sense of outrage rippled through the neighborhood. It became clear that the $7,600 used to fix the clubhouse was money spent to correct problems that the board had intentionally neglected. Karen Whitfield and the other board members attempted to defend themselves during a follow-up meeting. Karen insisted that any oversights had been unintentional and that she and her colleagues had acted in good faith. "We had to prioritize other projects," she said, her voice wavering. The pool resurfacing, landscaping, and community events required funds, and the leaks were minor. Hardly emergencies at the time. Marissa shook her head. Minor leaks left unattended eventually caused major damage. Your decisions weren't careful. They were negligent. Now our reserve fund is depleted, and residents' trust has been broken. Several neighbors nodded, their frustration boiling over. The auditors also uncovered more troubling information. Certain contractors had billed for work outside their scope, and some invoices had been approved without inspection or verification. In one instance, $1,200 was billed for replacing flooring that was never replaced, as confirmed by a follow-up inspection. Every discovery seemed to uncover more evidence of carelessness or mismanagement. Marissa realized that the problem was systemic. The HOA's culture of ignoring small issues to save money had led directly to the $7,600 repair, and it could have led to even worse consequences had structural damage been ignored for another year. During the audit, residents began to demand accountability. Meetings grew louder and more confrontational. Marcus, standing at the podium, read aloud sections of emails showing deliberate decisions to delay repairs. "This isn't just oversight. This is willful negligence," he said. "Our money is being misused, and the board must take responsibility." Karen Whitfield shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Other board members avoided eye contact, their expressions a mix of defensiveness and unease. The coalition's evidence left no room for denial. One afternoon, the auditors called a special session with the board. The findings were damning. A combination of delayed repairs, inaccurate invoicing, and mismanagement had caused the water damage that led to the $7,600 repair. The report recommended disciplinary actions for board members, mandatory process improvements, and reimbursement of the misused funds. When Marissa and the coalition were presented with the draft report, they felt a surge of vindication. Their months of meticulous record-keeping, investigations, and advocacy had produced results. The board could no longer hide behind excuses or vague promises. News of the audit's findings spread quickly through Willow Creek Estates. Residents who had once been skeptical about Marissa's efforts now approached her and the coalition with congratulations and support. People shared stories of other minor issues they had noticed but assumed were too trivial to report. The clubhouse had been a wake-up call, and now the residents were determined to ensure that no further mismanagement would go unchecked. The community felt empowered, unified by the revelation that transparency and vigilance could protect their shared resources. Yet the situation was far from over. Karen and a few board members still held power, and some resisted the auditor's recommendations. Meetings continued, sometimes heated, as residents pushed for reforms and restructuring. Marissa realized that while the audit had uncovered the truth about the $7,600 repair and the board's negligence, enforcing change would require persistence, collaboration, and sometimes confrontation. The stakes were no longer just financial. They were about the integrity of Willow Creek Estates and the ability of the community to govern itself responsibly. By the end of the month, the community was preparing to implement the auditor's recommendations. New oversight processes were proposed, including verification of all maintenance work, stricter accounting for the reserve fund, and clearer channels for reporting issues. Marissa and the coalition were recognized by residents for their role in uncovering the truth and advocating for accountability. The clubhouse, once a symbol of neglect and mismanagement, had become a focal point for positive change. Residents were optimistic, but they knew vigilance would be required to ensure the lessons learned were not forgotten. As Marissa walked past the clubhouse that evening, the sun setting behind the neighborhood trees, she noticed the fresh smell of drying wood and the faint hum of repair work continuing inside. The $7,600 repair had been expensive, but it had exposed a much larger problem. The community had come together, evidence had been uncovered, and accountability had been demanded. For the first time, Willow Creek Estates felt like a place where residents could actively protect their neighborhood, their money, and their trust. Marissa smiled, realizing that this was only the beginning of a stronger, more responsible community. More stories are coming. Subscribe to follow along.